Hello, everyone, and welcome to ELNET's Monday briefing. I'm Mark Sachs, ELNET Southeast Director. I can't help but think there's some connection between President Trump sitting stage side at the UFC event held on the grounds of the White House this weekend and simultaneously announcing the MOU between the US and Iran. And I can't help but feel a bit more skeptical and a bit more cynical as a result. Perhaps it's what French philosopher Guy Debord called the society of the spectacle. In his book, he wrote, quote, that authentic social life has been replaced by consumer culture and surface level appearances, unquote. How else can one explain that Trump cast the MOU, at least as reported, as a win despite failing on every stated objective? Iran cannot obtain nuclear weapons, fail. Must relinquish its enriched uranium, fail. Must dismantle its proxy system, fail. And cease its ballistic missile program, fail. In other words, Iran cannot project power outside its borders. Fail. Did the best and baddest negotiator in the world just get out-chickened and out-negotiated? Were the cool planes and big bombs that go boom just a spectacle? And if they were just a spectacle with no real connection to the underlying principles that unleashed them, perhaps it lends credence to Kissinger's famous quip that, quote, it may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal. Was the White House UFC fight a metaphor where both fighters are left bloodied and bruised, but still standing and both claiming victory? Unlike the UFC, however, where the fight is between two people, there are winners, losers, and survivors of this war outside of the US, Iran, and Israel, and they will be the ones that decide the future. Before I introduce our guest, Zineb, I'd like to offer a quick ELNET PSA. PSA. ELNET works to broaden and deepen diplomatic, defense and security, and economic cooperation between Europe and Israel. Through our 7 regional offices in Europe and Israel, we work in nearly 36 countries and at the EU Parliament and NATO. As of today, our work is going to get harder than it was just yesterday, as if that wasn't hard enough. This MOU seems to bode well for the adversaries of Israel, the US, and Europe. ELNET is a 501c3 organization, so your support is tax deductible. If you'd like to learn more, do more, and invest more, contact anyone at ELNET in the US and visit elnetus.org. Now, I'd like to introduce our returning guest, Zineb Riboua. Zineb is a research fellow at the Hudson Institute Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East, where she specializes in Chinese and Russian involvement in the Middle East. She also has a spectacular Substack called Beyond the Ideological, which I consider mandatory reading, and I think you should too. So Zineb, welcome back. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the very kind introduction and for having me on again. Thank you.
So you heard me say that I'm a bit more skeptical and cynical before. I said that to you when we were, before everybody logged in. Are you going to be able to disabuse me of feeling that way? Or are you ultimately going to prove that I'm right?
Yes, I think a little bit more differently than you do, and I see the situation from a very different angle. I think that this MOU is simply an extension of the ceasefire. It's a 60-day, basically ceasefire to talk again and to negotiate again over the nuclear question and the proxies and so on, without the United States lifting sanctions, and with Iran publicly agreeing to not weaponize the Strait of Hormuz. And it actually matters if we're thinking about the insurers who interact with the strait, with the oil prices and the energy markets, especially because they have been absolutely harming Europe and the Gulf. And so from my perspective, it's about Trump actually extending the ceasefire and buying time so that things stabilize a little bit before he goes back to it again. Because it's very unlikely that that the Iranians agree when it comes to the enrichment and to the proxies and so on. And it's true that the Iranians absolutely declared that there will be this transfer of funds and so on, but this hasn't been there is no proof of that. There is no proof that they're going to get anything in return. There are statements here and there, but from my perspective, this is like a deja vu where you have Trump basically saying, "Oh, we have peace with Iran. We're going to do great things with Iran," and then we get back to it. I mean, it's the same thing that happened in June 2025. So I take all of these statements with a grain of salt by taking into consideration the energy markets, the midterms that are coming, but also with Trump's other ambitions in Latin America, in Cuba, in Nicaragua, and other places. And also, there is no move or retreat of US assets yet. I have not seen that. That's actually a very important indicator. The sanctions are also still in place, as I mentioned, and not just on Iran, but also on China. It actually matters enormously. So, in many ways, I don't see it as a bleak thing. So this is the first one, the first part of it. The second part is that I don't think that the United States lost in any way. First of all, because the war is still ongoing. A ceasefire and an MOU does not mean that the war is over, and also because the situation with Iran is just very different than it was. I mean, people forget that just a few years ago we had Iranian shaheds going to Russia. We had China financing left and right Iranian proxies. We had the Houthis with anti-ship ballistic missiles on the verge of not just weaponizing the Red Sea, but also probably also collaborating with Somalia. We had Armenia and Azerbaijan being absolutely bogged down and at war with each other, with Iran influencing the region as well. We had also Iran, through Hezbollah and other proxies, getting more influence in Africa and Latin America. I mean, especially in Africa and the Sahel, the Iranians got a uranium deal with Niger. So these things are not insignificant, and they have been absolutely, I think, challenged, and the United States challenged them. The amount of missiles and drones and so on that Iran had, well, it's no longer the case today. Yes, there are a lot of issues, but we're from a very different situation, and Iran is weaker than it was before, and the economic situation of Iran is as a good testimony of that. Also, Trump is the first president for decades that broke the status quo on Iran, targeting directly Khamenei, the leadership, going after the IRGC, and so on. So in many ways, yes, things are not as we wish them to be, but I think it's going to be a long process. This war is not very easy on the markets and with the president looking at the midterms and so on. So I think these are different factors to take into consideration. And the last one is that the Trump administration sanctioned China. This is a very, I think, underrated action. Sanctioning Chinese teapot refineries, shipping firms, and so on. It's not an easy thing to do because there's always a retaliation that might happen, but the administration did it, and Xi Jinping today no longer buys from Iranian sources. So for all of these reasons, I don't see it as black and as your Mark,
As bleak,
as
as
bleak.
bleak and
Sorry.
negative as I
Yes.
painted it out to
Yes.
be. All right, so points well taken. I think everything you said, of course, is accurate. I think that's probably obviously the optimist's perspective on this. So I think it'll be a really interesting exploration as we go through some of the go through this discussion a little bit more and find out who actually and why is going to come out of this a bit stronger and what it means for the future. So let's talk about the winners, losers, and what I'll call, the survivors here. So I'm going to play the cynic. I think the winners here are Iran, Turkey, and China. I think the losers here are the U.S., Israel, and UAE. And I think the survivors are Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Where do your winners, losers, and survivors fall, given the countries that I just named? Who do you think the winners, losers, and survivors are, and why?
I think the I think the winners is United States. I mean, I think the United States is definitely winning. It has completely reconstructed the energy market. It it did so many deals out of this Iran war. I mean, the fact that Japan today is a big buyer of U.S. energy is a big deal. It wasn't the case since I think World War II or World War One. The South Koreans as well. They're taking part in the U.S. energy revival. I also think that despite Israel being in a very tough situation when it comes to Lebanon, the Iran threat is not what it was.
Mhm.
And finally, I think Gulf countries, despite a lot of the fragmentation, I do think that there was this Iran veto. Whenever they wanted to do something with the United States, they were under direct threat from Iran. And it was the case when the Saudis wanted to normalize with Israel. It was the case when the Syrians, even today, want to do things um, to no longer be just a logistics hub. And I think that kind of freed up some of the environment for Gulf countries and for other countries to take action without having a veto over them from Iran. I would put Turkey in its own spot just because there is, I think, from what I've seen, a lot of animosity towards Israel, a lot of skepticism towards a regime change in Iran, but they absolutely agree that Iran should not have nuclear weapons. And so it puts them in their own political game in a totally different category, a little bit with Pakistan, I would say, and
Mhm.
Oman. Um, but if I think that if things go well and if there is a real end to the war that favors the United States and its allies, well, Turkey will benefit from it because inside Iran there is a Turkic population, and the Turks are growing this I think organization of Turkic states and so on. And it helps them also anchor their partner Azerbaijan in the region and so on. So from my perspective, I think Turkey is in its own spot. Well, the losers, I would put China and Russia and Iran first because for a very long time the I think China was benefiting from the loss of trust towards the United States, especially from Gulf countries. People forget that Obama, one of the things that he did was that he tried to negotiate a GCPOA without including Gulf countries. Well, this time they are, and in fact, they're collaborating and giving targets and collaborating on targets through CENTCOM. Every single operation has been coordinated through CENTCOM. That gives you actually a basis for the Abraham Accords 2.0. There's also the fact that, the moment the operation started, there was a bet from the Iranians' perspective that the Arab street will come out and denounce the Zionist and the American entity for going against the IRGC. None of it happened. In fact, today the Arabs are much more, I think, aggressive towards the IRGC than they were before, precisely because they've seen what they've done in Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere, but also because they also hit them. They hit their facilities, they hit the desalination plants. Even Qatar, that had an absolutely wonderful relationship with the Iranians and could had discussions with them, they got hit. That actually changes a lot of the dynamics, I think, that do not favor the Iranians. And also do not favor China because China can no longer position itself as this great mediator between Gulf Arab countries and Iran. In fact, the Saudi-Iran normalization deal that was brokered in China, in Beijing, was not useful for Saudi Arabia. At the end of the day, the Saudis had to call the United States. Also, from for China, as I mentioned earlier, the sanctions are absolutely horrendous for them, for their economy. the sanctions are very, I think, an important tool because for a very long time, China was able to get discounted Iranian oil that was helping them build up their industrial capacity in a way that it can compete with the Europeans and so on who were buying at price market. That's not an insignificant thing, but it's also something that they no longer have. And finally, Russia, because it was very interesting to me about how a lot of the Iranian drones that were hitting Gulf countries and that the Ukrainians seized that time, seized that moment, and they went to the Gulf monarchies. A lot of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and others are now collaborating with Ukraine on that front. That actually elevated the Ukrainians in a way that the Russians were seen as simply unreliable, not trustworthy, and they were just not there, despite Saudi-Russia relationship being quite okay. So it favored the Ukrainians, but also, as I mentioned, the I think the erosion and of IRGC and Iranian influence helps actually build up this Azerbaijan and Armenia, Turkish integration in the region that does not favor the Russians. The Russians today no longer really discuss matters on the Caucasus and the South Caucasus with Iran. I think that's a big blow for their influence in the region. And more importantly, I think, is why I also think that China is a loser in this, is that I think prior to the war, I think in 2023, there was this, I think, bloc that was really emerging of China, Russia, Iran, being this kind of, I wouldn't say revisionism, but it was really a kind of block, especially on the financial side, but also on the energy side, just suggesting that they can replace the West and they can promote a kind of a revolutionary view of how global governance should be that would elevate the global South and so on. But I think the fact that the Arab countries have been hit and the Chinese were not there was actually a big blow to their influence as well. So in many ways, I don't think that Iran was a big winner in this. In fact, the 60-day ceasefire MOU or whatever, with the sanctions still in place, it does not help their economy. And I quite suspect that there are other sanctions that are coming as well. So we will see, but this is how I see it so far.
Okay. So I'm going to try to, that was a lot there and very helpful because that was a lot of information and really interesting insight. I'm going to unpack a little bit of that sort of let's start with Iran. Its economy is certainly in great distress. We don't know what's in the MOU. When you look at what the US version is, it's 5 or 6 points. When you look at the Iranian version, it's a ridiculous 16 points or something like that. And most of those are outlandish statements or assertions that will be part of the negotiations. Having said that, Iran only needed to, meaning I would say the regime in Iran only needs to survive. So they've survived. They have shown that they could withstand the two most powerful militaries in the world. Conversely, the two most powerful militaries in the world just kind of demonstrated to the world where their limitations are. China didn't launch a missile. They had their entire weapons capacity at full capacity. United States has depleted its capacities entirely. China controls the material production, which would be the rare earth minerals needed to rebuild all of our capacities. The Qataris and Saudis, while they're concerned about Iran, supplicated themselves to Iran. They paid Iran. They now see that they have to live with Iran because Iran is likely there for good, barring internal divisions that bring it down. They found that it may not be in their best interest to stand with the United States, which they didn't entirely. and they are forming relationships with Pakistan, with Turkey, and potentially with China. And Turkey will leave to a little bit later. So that's kind of the other side here of the perspective that China kept their powder dry. They're surviving. And if Iran is left to play another day, if sanctions are lifted, if assets are provided to Iran, then China has an opportunity to play that game pretty seriously, help build Iran, keep a key ally strong, and may set its sights on Taiwan, recognizing how limited we are and what our actual stomach is for war. Your thoughts?
Um, I mean, your thesis is based on a lot of ifs. And so far, yes, it's true that China will survive this, but the whole point of China having a good relationship with Iran and building up Iran was, first of all, making sure that Iran was a kind of a laboratory when it came to sanctions evasion, which is no longer the case. I mean, now we have sanctions in place and the permissive, basically, jurisdiction that the Chinese were using, where they did not have to carry that dollar-denominated risk. I think it kind of vanished. That was the whole point of Beijing building up and having a good relationship with Iran. It was very especially important when we were thinking about Taiwan, the Indo-Pacific, but also for China to really not be in a position where whatever it would do something, that there would be an avalanche of sanctions that would hit it, just like what happened to Putin. So in that way, I think that China just no longer has that card. The second thing is that I don't think that China surviving this and still having energy is actually a bad thing. The whole point is to make sure that China does not have access to energy that is discounted and sanctioned. Buying at market price is enough to actually provoke a huge problem for China, because their whole model is based on an export economy and cheap energy, and now they're going to coal and other things, and it's not enough when you have an AI strategy and an AI policy and so on. Um, so there is that. And finally, well, it's true that the regime is surviving, they're still there, but they don't have the same instruments that they used to. I mean, for the longest time, they were capable of enriching uranium at a strong pace. It was unsustainable. Yes, the United States no longer has the same weapons it used to have, or the same number of this or that, but there was a real problem where the IRGC, they were going for a nuclear bomb. What should the president of the United States do? Just watch it and sit and look at it from afar, or do something, make sure that at least the IRGC cannot really recruit. In fact, right now they have issues recruiting people, and they're calling for children, age 12-year-old, to join their ranks, and that's a real problem they're facing. And so when it comes to the strategic picture, I think that the Iranians surviving does not mean that they're winning. This 60-day ceasefire is another, I think, way to just for Trump to buy time, and in buying time, the Iranians have always been very clever at that. But as long as sanctions are in place, they're not in a good position. You can see that in their currency. You can see that in their inflation. Iranians are themselves, the people, they no longer have the same trust they used to in their economy. The shadow banking system that China was building, that was in fact also in the UAE, is no longer as effective as it used to be. And there were also different tools that were used in Belarus and so on to cut off the IRGC. So in many ways, I think that it's not as easy as it is for the United States, but also I wouldn't have a demoralizing position. I think it's actually very good for the United States to have the IRGC at this state. it's true that there are other problems, and I wish things could go in a very different way. But with the whole economic pressure, especially on the energy markets, it's very hard to say what was the alternative.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't want to go back to the status quo ante before the war. I think it was obviously a necessity. I'm questioning now the pursuit or the tactics at this point, and how it was pursued over the last 6 weeks, and who's left as a result of this, and as a in a stronger position or weaker position. So I completely agree with you on not. It's a fool's errand to litigate. Should we have gone in or not? I think. Um, so let me ask you this: outside of Iran, does China have a larger Middle East strategy?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that you know, China will always have a Middle East strategy in the sense that, historically, whenever China would expand and have a wider economy and better trade and so on, they will always look at the Middle East. It's very important for the routes. It's very important for also, especially today, for the capital that is needed, to raise for different AI companies, for different things, for different sectors. The Middle East is also a very young market. It's not yet a saturated market. So for China, it's a very good opportunity as well. So it will always try to, have get closer to Gulf countries and so on. But I think that this time it will be harder to build what it built in Iran. It's very hard to replicate and to duplicate and to have another country or another state that plays the same role that Iran did, not just on the sanctions side, but also on the military side. It's very useful to have a partner, that is constantly, basically, I would say, humiliating the United States, just like the Houthis were doing in the Red Sea, testing the drones in the battlefield, sharing that intel with China. In fact, China was actually helping Iran with the targeting data, and they've been
Mhm.
helping them for a very long time. It's very hard to find another Gulf country that would do so. So in many ways, they will not have, I would say, the same posture. Their posture will be under a U.S. security system, and I would say that this is what actually matters, because for what you said on Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and so on, I think it's totally true, and I think that there's also a UAE Saudi Arabia basically competition ongoing on what the future of the Middle East should look like and who should lead it and etc. But what should actually really matter is whether that competition happens inside a US security architecture or not. Because if it's not, like what Iran was doing, that's a real problem. And I think that narrowing those options is the biggest task of the United States. Um, Also, I have to say as well that this whole operation was conducted, with the United States and Israel collaborating at an intense and an unseen level. That in itself helps the United States actually pitch why collaborating with Israel and integrating Israel more and more matters. Um, I know that it's not as clear now, but I watch a lot of TV and on in Arabic, and I consume a lot of Arab media, and I was very surprised by what I've seen, in a sense that they were basically saying that they were saying openly that Iran is the threat, not Israel, and that they should collaborate with Israel, especially on the military and defense side. And you can hear that from Kuwaitis, from Iraqis, and so on. That's kind of incredible,
Mhm.
actually, on what this operation is actually, I think, helping people understand. And Israeli power is, I think, the best. I think is the best pitch for why collaborating with it matters. So in many ways, I would say that this operation was also helpful in making that pitch, but also in opening up different opportunities, including the India Middle East corridor. The India Middle East Europe corridor is it was just an idea like a few years ago. Not many people paid attention to it, but now with the Strait of Hormuz blockade that happened, well, many countries, especially the UAE, India, even Saudi Arabia and Jordan, they're thinking about how to go around that, deprive Iran from that choke point. And a lot of that project would necessitate a certain collaboration with Israel. That also is a huge opportunity that this operation helped show. So,
So let me pause you there because I think that was a great point you brought up. I was going to bring it up a little bit later, but I want to stick on it right now because you are an expert on IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. You've been working on it a long time, and just last week I said, "Uh oh, it just got a big hit, as in a negative hit to its likelihood," and that came from the agreement between Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Turkey for the I think it's called the Hajez pipeline to
yeah.
pipe, which is a little bit different. It's pipeline, but it's a pipeline that goes up through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria to Turkey. Does that reduce the likelihood of IMEC and Saudi Arabia tilting a nod or nodding towards Israel?
Yeah, I actually don't think so. Let me tell you why. I actually spoke with different people from different countries on this, and my take is the following: is that corridor that you just mentioned, it was basically going to happen because the Turks basically need it for their own export economy. Their economy is not very much is not doing well, and Syria is a great opportunity for that. So it was bound to happen. The second reason why is that you can always connect it. You can always connect it to iMac. And in fact, it's good that you have different routes that you can connect and rather to not have any. In fact, if it goes through, you will have other countries telling you, no, we actually need ours as well, and there's already iMac and so on. So it actually makes it easier. Um, it does look that way with Turkey and Saudi Arabia not being in a very good relationship with Israel right now. But things change just like they changed with the UAE and Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Israel. So I wouldn't say that it was a big hit to IMEC.
Okay, that's good. Good to hear. Thanks for that. Let's start moving our way through to Europe because I have some questions around Europe here. But I want to start with Turkey as our way to Europe. Turkey looks at NATO as being pretty weak. It's becoming more anti-West, anti-EU, anti-NATO. It's seeing benefits in aligning with China, particularly for its interests in Africa. Its interior minister just said Jerusalem will one day fall under our dominion. Help us understand what this relationship is likely to look like and where you think Turkey and Europe are likely to go, or perhaps what Europe should do, if anything, to counteract where Turkey is going.
Yeah, actually, what really worries me as well is the European EU position towards Israel because of the boycotts that Europe also does all the time against Israel and Israeli companies. And so it gives, I think, Turkey another argument to just escalate and take a harsher position that the Europeans already have. So I think that it's a big task for the United States. I think that first of all, it's very important for Turkey to dismiss and to also eliminate and change a lot of its posture, but it will have to come from the United States. I think the pressure needs to come from the United States, especially because Turkey and Israel need to collaborate at some point and have a certain deconflicting strategy on Syria if the United States wants it to be a stable place. So I think that's what needs to happen on Turkey, Israel, but also on Turkey and Europe, as I mentioned, I think this is unlikely to change with Europe continuing the boycotts because it gives tools for Turkey to escalate. I think, however, that the problem today, especially when it comes to how Israel is viewed, is that I think Turkey is really very much engaged in a not in a war, but basically in a race regarding who is going to be the leader of the Muslim world. As you know, Saudi Arabia, I wouldn't say they're liberalizing, but they're definitely modernizing. Well, Iran is weaker than it was before, and it was really the one having that monopoly over the Palestinian question. And so Turkey naturally sees, specifically Erdogan, naturally sees an opportunity and an opening there because he can just seize what the Iranians and the Saudis are not tackling, which is the Palestinian question, so that he can elevate himself and elevate the Turkish soft power. And I think that this is how I read it when it comes to power plays. Um, and obviously, this is why I think that the United States and the Gaza Peace Board and so on was actually a very good tactic in neutralizing that and making sure that Gulf countries no longer use that, or Turkey use that to engage in other issues. Because what was happening a few months ago was that whenever the United States would engage in a policy or in a position, well, there was this Gaza was always the center of it, and so I think putting that aside and making sure that everyone sees that Hamas is a terrorist organization that despite Turkey and others being themselves included does not want an end to the war or to surrender and so on. I think it helps a lot. These types of the conflicting strategies can as well happen, but also, for Israel, I think that Israel should simply, I think, continue what it's been doing, which is to make sure that it survives and that the terrorist organizations that keep harming its population do not do so. And it's because at the end of the day, the politics of the Europeans, the Turks, they're going to change. They might change. We might see other governments and so on. And so I don't think that Israel surrendering because it wants to be good with everybody would work. I think Israel, whenever it did that, it paid a price for it. But I would say that there are other ways. There are other ways through which Israel can engage, and it's mainly through the United States. There are frameworks such as Pax Silica, where you have different countries from Europe and Israel. You have from Europe and the Middle East are collaborating, having zones that have supply chain protection and security and so on. Well, these are frameworks through which Israel can engage. But other than that, I think the task is really for the United States to tackle.
Well, thanks on that. And on that note, our Warsaw office for Central and Eastern Europe co-sponsored the Cybertech conference in Warsaw, which was all around, in essence, Pax Silica, bringing industry
Yeah.
experts, technology, and geopolitical experts together in one place. There were 400 people from around Europe and the Middle East there to discuss, how to build these technology and political bridges. So I would agree with you. That's the way to go. And I appreciate your optimism. You're starting to sell me, Zineb. I may have to give you a call in those dire times where I need a little bit more optimism. You're making a good argument. I'm going to go to some questions now. I'm going to turn first. We have a question. Member of the European Parliament, Tomas Martinaitis. He's from Lithuania. He asked if you could elaborate on your position regarding Taiwan. Does the Iran crisis make it more likely or less likely that China could make a move on Taiwan?
I think that I see it as less likely in a sense that the United States actually restored deterrence when it comes to preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons, from building up this missiles, drones architecture, and from really humiliating the IRGC at a large scale, and from also sanctioning China. I think that in that sense, it makes it very hard for China to make a move. In fact, I've seen a lot of reports and revisions of them making a move. Second, it's important to pay attention to China's economy and to China's energy situation. It's not very good, especially because of the sanctions that are coming from the United States. There's something actually that I thought was very interesting that happened. So before the Trump Xi summit, the Trump administration put enormous sanctions on the shipping firms to the teapots and so on, but they escalated and put even more. And Xi Jinping issued a prohibiting order, basically saying to Chinese companies, you don't have to comply to U.S. sanctions. And I have not seen any response from the U.S. Treasury to that or anything because it does not matter what Xi Jinping says. The moment the Chinese companies engage in the with the dollar, engage in the economy, well, they have to abide by those sanctions, and that in itself, I think, is enough to scare China when it comes to moving against Taiwan and so on. They will, of course, continue the intimidation, etc. But I think the United States is in a better place than it was, I think, a year ago, with Iran just no longer being able to play the role that China wanted it to play.
I want to remind everybody you're still welcome to submit some questions. We have some in the queue. We're likely to get to everybody. So send in a question if you have one. Zineb, let me ask you, France has been leading the charge for more restrictive policies towards China and its overcapacity, industrial capacity within Europe. They're talking about revaluation of currencies, tariffs, made in Europe only rules. What impact would that have on China? It's already being hurt in terms of oil. How do you see the practical impact to China if if European countries actually move forward in strict trade policies with China?
I think it would be a good thing for Europe to join the United States when it comes to all of these restrictions. However, I suspect that they are in a much, I would say, um, fragile position because of their energy policy and a lot of the environmental regulations around that, etc. I think that Germany is moving to change, especially when it comes to its energy policy. France is in a better position due to nuclear energy and so on. But I think it will be very hard for the Europeans. However, it's not impossible. I think it's really a matter of having the courage to do so. And this is where I think when you mentioned Europe-Israel relationship, why it actually matters. Well, it actually matters because the Israel can be actually helpful for Europe when it comes to countering China. A lot of the emerging technologies, disruptive technologies on cybersecurity, on agri-tech, on biotech. These are all sectors where Israel takes the leadership and has a leading position. And for the Europeans to fortify that link, it actually helps when it comes to having alternatives to the Chinese when it comes to their technology and also making Europeans much more competitive.
Well, I think that's also a very strong argument for Europe working closely with Abraham Accords countries because you're friend-shoring a lot of opportunity, your supply chains to favorable countries. And that gets to a question that I think John Mirish had. Yes. So with the Abraham Accords in mind, some people are really negative on the future of the Abraham Accords and say the expansion is just not going to happen anytime soon. What are your thoughts on that? Are you seem to be more of an optimist by nature? Do you think we're going to see a greater expansion of that? And do you think Trump is going, or does he have the ability to hasten that?
I think that if we don't see an expansion, we will see an upgrade in the Abraham Accords in the sense that I think what happened really during this operation is that you have CENTCOM on one hand, Gulf countries on the other, other countries as well, but also Israel collaborating in real time and exchanging intelligence and sharing different things. Um, in fact, I think the UAE understood very early on why its relationship with Israel actually paid off because they had missiles coming from Iranians directly hitting them, and that in itself is, I think, absolutely important for all of these countries. I think they see now where the threat is really coming from. So I think that it is very possible that we will see an upgrade of the Abraham Accords being a mere symbolic or normalization agreement to a really maybe a defense agreement or a security agreement. The fact the On the expansion is very possible. And in fact, we had already Kazakhstan trying to join. Azerbaijan already has a relationship with Israel, but if they are integrated in the Abraham Accords, it will be a good thing. Saudi Arabia remains an open question because of all the fluctuations, but there are other countries that maybe that might join, and I think especially of countries like Kuwait and Mauritania and others. So I think I wouldn't dismiss the fact that other countries would join. Also, I've had the experience of, I think it was in 2020, where I actually was thinking, I told a friend, I think it was March 2020, that we should not actually dismiss maybe that Morocco and Israel would normalize. And he was just laughing at me. He thought I was absolutely crazy for thinking so. But my argument was that, we have Morocco as a huge Israel Jewish diaspora in Israel. There are a lot of, and so it's not an impossible thing. It just needs the right moment, the right timing, and so these things can happen anytime. And I think that, especially as I mentioned earlier, Israel is not just a military power. It also possesses what I think are the keys for the future of the economy, especially due to the AI revolution and to all of these technologies that are developing. Every country today is looking around, looking for with about and looking for new partners, and also thinking more creatively about how to get ahead and to be integrated in that type of economy. And this is why you can see Saudi Arabia and also the UAE doubling down on the AI sector and on developing fintech and so on. Israel is absolutely crucial for that, especially because on the cybersecurity sector that is important that they have. And so I think that the possibilities of expansion, I know right now it sounds very delusional, but I wouldn't dismiss that.
Well, in there, I think you did address Stuart Slome's question, but I'll give him the credit for this because he did bring it up and say or mention that for the first time, Israel provided an Iron Dome battery to another country, and that was the UAE in defense of the UAE. And I think that's a good case that there's an opportunity for future treaties or future cooperation between some of the Gulf states and Israel.
Yeah, and I think that the I haven't seen actually good surveys of the public opinion in the Arab world. But what I can say is that the fact that you have people on Al Arabiya openly saying that Iran is the enemy and not Israel is a very good indicator of how people are thinking and processing this war. It's just something that I've never heard before. And it's worth actually reiterating. I translated some of them actually on my Substack just to make a point. But the region, despite the war, people want jobs. These countries, they understand they have a demographic issue, that that there's going to be youth unemployment, that their facilities have just been hit by Iran. That if things go back to how they were, well, the energy prices will go down. They will not have the same resources as they used to have. The AI revolution is coming, and they need to invest and prepare their population for that. Well, there is only blaming Israel for every single thing can only help for so long. And a lot of them realize that Israel as a scapegoat just no longer works. They have to do reforms. They have to see the potential Israel has. I think that this is where a lot of the conversation is going. And you can see that with Silica, IMEC, but also on just some of the Abraham Accords sideline cooperation that is already happening.
Got a question from Victor. Um, do you think Iran will ever stop enrichment of uranium?
No, I don't think so. I think the United States will have to eventually do something about it, either take it or find a way. But I think taking the I wouldn't make the bet that they would just stop and that we should trust them on that.
Okay. All right. So let me sort of wind down with this. We talked about Turkey, talked about Europe, talked about China and the Middle East. There is a nexus there somewhere that in terms of policy. What do you think are the policy decisions that we should be trying to affect that positions the Europe-Israel relationship and Abraham Accords allies favorably? What policies do we need Europeans to be thinking about to ensure that Turkey, Russia, China axis does not foment any unnecessary tension or continue to develop in that region?
I think that the first policy I always think of is really about doing something on the boycotts. The boycotts are absolutely, I think, harmful. Not just because they're directed towards Israeli companies, but they are directed towards any European company that is successful these days. Just because there's a lot of the anti-Semitic conspiracies ongoing, and that, oh, this company must be successful because of evil Zionist conspiracy. And I think that these things are very much related. And you can see that in the type of groups that are pushing the boycotts. And I think that doing something about it is very much worth considering. Second, there's already enough, I think, platforms and frameworks through which a lot of European countries can already engage. And so far, they've just been taking a step back. And I think that there's a lot of political cost to that, I suspect, from a lot of their constituents and so on. But they have to get in the game, especially when it comes to, as I mentioned, technologies and so on, because otherwise, I think Europe will just be left behind. There's also the fact that, Israelis bring the technology, Gulf countries, they bring the market, but also the capital. There's a lot of synergy there because Europe has the industrial capacity. Um, and I think that these things are very important to capitalize on, or at least make clear, because policies can only get you so far. But if there is a better strategic understanding of why this matters, not just for now, but for the next 10 years, I think it can change a lot of things. And finally, I think that especially because of what is happening on in Ukraine, and also how the Russians have been especially aggressive towards Europe, and all the activities they've been doing when it comes to cyber attacks and so on. I think that Europe should realize, and I think it did, that it doesn't have many friends, and that it doesn't have many friends it can rely on. And while Israel cannot openly take a strong position when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, and so on, I think Israelis have been working immensely behind the scenes. And this is, I think, an opportunity for Europe that is looking just in its own neighborhood, seeing the Russians seizing part of Ukraine. So I think that there's a basic security question there, that basically reasserts itself. And so this is also maybe not a matter of policy, but on strategic perspective that needs to be, I think, outlined and said out loud.
We got a question from Larry Hochberg. How critical is the two-state issue to sort of the positive occurrences you've laid out? Is it still a major issue for many of these countries, or
I think it is for Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Um, for Qatar, the Omanis are pretty silent about it, but I think that there was basically for them a momentum before the Gaza Board of Peace, as I mentioned, and then it got neutralized, and now there's just no point in talking about it because they're engaged in making sure that Hamas disarms, and it's not. And so they are forced to that reality, to accepting that, and to getting back to their population about how, okay, this is just not happening. But as I said, I think it has a rhetoric and political utility for a lot of these countries. And so this is where the United States needs to um, neutralize it, but especially make sure that there's no animosities there, and that it's the United States that is actually leading, and that Israel is also leading when it comes to its own security.
well, Zineb, you have acquitted the optimist's position quite well. I hope everybody is feeling a little bit more optimistic about where we are today and where we may go. I'd like to welcome to the floor Tom Flesch, ELNET Chair, to offer some closing remarks. Still on mute. There you go. You're good.
Okay, great. First of all, Zineb, I want to just thank you for your insights. And I don't want to say optimistic thinking about the future. I like to feel that it is realistic. And so that
I appreciate that.
yeah, and the words that you're saying really aligned with Israel's, in my opinion, strategy to be at a point where they produce something that the world needs. So, irrespective of a political or some background that may be based on anti Semitism or on other kinds of reasons, they'd still produce things that the world needs. And as long as they stay in that position, I think that Israel will stay ahead of the game and Israel has a future. And the reasons that you also enunciated, I'm not going to repeat them now. I think those are all very, very important. So I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. We're doing our share at ELNET to try to make the relationships between Europe, the EU, and UK with Israel as prosperous as possible on many fronts. I want to say that Larry, it was great to have Larry's question. Larry is my mentor, the founder of ELNET, a co-founder of ELNET, and you can always rely on Larry to give a really good in-depth presentation or ask questions that are founded on a lot of facts. And so we thank Larry for participation and everybody else who asked questions today. So I think this was a wonderful reason to be optimistic today as a result of this conversation. And we know that there's a lot of work ahead of us. And I know you can't trust the Iranians based on their past performance, but I still remain optimistic. And I think the world is changing. And I think the dependence on fossil fuel is changing and the delivery of the fossil. There are a lot of factors that are going adverse against their economy. And so let's just be hopeful and optimistic. And with that, I want everybody listening, make no mistake about it. ELNET is very, very, very active in pursuing and building the relationship between Europe and Israel. No doubt about it. Our challenges are many, but we confront them and we do a good job. And as Mark said earlier, this all comes at a cost when the US dollar is weak against the shekel and against the euro. And therefore, for every dollar that we raise, it only has 80 cents worth of buying power. So just to tread water and stay the same, we need to raise 20% more than we have before. But we are really working very, very hard. We're seeing good results, but our hurdle just to stay even is 20% more than we did last year. So we thank all of our supporters. We ask them sincerely to help understand our challenges with the financial part. And you know the challenges that we have with Israeli relationships, but we're working diligently on this, and we thank everyone for their support. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to our staff, everybody. Have a nice week. We hope that we're going to have good news in the days ahead.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks again, Zineb. We're going to have you back. And everybody, enjoy your day.
Thank you, especially Mark and Tom for having me, and special thanks to everyone who listened and shared their questions and thoughts. And I know I'm a minority opinion, but someone has to defend the position, and I hope I'll be proven right, and maybe I'll be back, maybe I'll be proven wrong, and I'll admit that. But that's what I see so far, and I'm happy to share my insights with you.
We appreciate your insight. That's why you're here. So thank you again, Zineb.